This is a documentary which has been heavily discussed online since its release, and for very just and valid reasons. Louis Theroux's The Settlers is an important piece for any who hold an opinion on the issues permeating in Israel and the Palestinian territories, particularly where the pathologies of certain Israeli civilians is concerned. Say what one will about Israel's right to defend itself from aggressive militias, to exist as a distinctly Jewish state, or to exist at all in the first place as an ethnic state, religious state, or ethno-religious state. The issue of the settlers is one in which even the Israeli government, at least in public, has widely denounced and not given their support to, despite not attempting to prevent their activities either, seemingly. What Theroux chose to explore was an element of Israeli society which appears to represent the hyper-nationalist mentality of a noteworthy fragment of its population. It seems as though Theroux wanted to focus upon one of the more inarguably unjust of Israel's behaviours, as well as follow up from a project he completed around 15 years prior, 2011's The Ultra-Zionists. Had Theroux focused upon the current military venture into the Gaza Strip, perhaps he would have risked, obviously his life first and foremost. The IDF have a possible bloodlust for international journalists and medical personnel, risked a journalistic undertaking which had its mind made up prior to the research itself. This might really be no bad thing. A disgust at Israel's invasion and rampant slaughter is probably unavoidable, and not productive for Theroux's approach to journalism. Theroux is willing to interact with the reviled Westboro Baptist Church, American sects of neo-Nazis, and prisoners who have committed the most appalling of criminal acts. He wanted to hear from these subjects why they feel or do the way, or actions, they do, assuming there was something he didn't understand or was yet to learn. I suspect that where the IDF's actions in the Gaza Strip were concerned, Theroux felt as though there was nothing to learn, no more than one would, about why Russian forces are swarming Ukraine, why the Saudi Arabian military were killing en masse in Yemen, why the current Syrian establishment is murdering blood-curdling sums of innocent civilians. Then he deduced it would be more useful to analyse how the civilian populace of Israel feels, why it supports the murderous government for all their sadism and identified corruption, but more importantly, the civilians who are so strident in their fervent Zionism that their passions go beyond a want to self-defense, bloody revenge, or the existence of a uniquely religious state, but into a shameless embodiment of what all Israelis have been accused of being by the neighbouring nations, of representing an expansionist, colonial, supremacist, racist, and undeniably aggressive entity. For all those who have defended Israel up to this present moment, whether their current violent actions or just to exist as it is, religious state or otherwise, they needed to address the hard fact that the behaviour of Israeli settlers upon the West Bank and Gaza Strip are exemplifying every severe criticism which that nation has received since the 1967 war, and probably before that too. A totally immersive experience which places you next to Theroux and his subjects in a land so arid, rocky, and wounded that it is bewildering any could deem it the Holy Land. We witness the shambling constructions which the Israeli settlers are building right atop and directly encroaching on existing Palestinian towns and establishments, that visibly fanatical energy as conferences and gatherings of pro-expansionist Israelis congregate at the edge of the West Bank or Gaza, and the Palestinian population themselves, subject to harassment by Israeli hooligans as well as the actual military guard, attempting to live as regular a life as possible, desensitized to the aggression and bullying shown to them by their brutish neighbors, living with so little, a life which most of us in the developed world could not possibly even imagine. And that's considering the relative poverty and general material scarceness alone, not even factoring in the threat of violence from the local Israelis on the present, and without much or any accountability from any governing body. At times, Louis and his crew are prospectively in danger as well, whether under threat of being arrested or being shot at by some ragtag bunch of what we might term Israeli rednecks, or bogans, yobbos, the equivalent of looking to do a bit of killing, hoping that the local sympathetic police would turn the other way, sinisterly. One of the smartest moves of the documentary, permitting actions to speak louder than words, is when the subject Daniela Weiss attempts to prove how the Palestinian peoples deceived the wider world via the existence of video recording technology. To illustrate her point, she shoves Theroux during an interview, and then claims that if he had shoved her back, and then the camera only began recording after her shove, it would appear that Theroux is attacking an older woman unprovoked. Thoreau is confused by her action and taken aback at the thought that he might have even considered shoving an old woman back after she had to him. I'm aware this moment was probably picked out by most reviewers and articles on this film, just allowing me to share my own awe in spite of it being likely unoriginal. She insists that the settler violence is only due to initial Palestinian provocation, which is supposedly not shown on the video recordings. She appears to firmly believe that the Palestinians are savvy, propagandic masterminds attempting to deceive the world that they are helpless victims when in fact they are gaslighting 4D chess playing terror geniuses. She turns back to Thoreau after this interview concludes, claiming, "I was hoping you would push back," referring to the prospective shoving which Thoreau would have committed against Daniela after she had to him. Did Weiss inadvertently demonstrate the Israeli strategy against the Palestinian populace? It is worth stating, though, during this piece, that I don't hold in high regard the organisation Hamas itself, and whilst I understand why such a group exists and gains popular support in such an extreme, desperate situation, such as that of the over half-century sustained Israeli suffocation, my heart sooner goes out to the civilians of Gaza itself, supporters of Hamas or otherwise, it does not matter, who don't deserve any of the callous violence they are currently experiencing or at any point in the more recent history of Palestine. They simply cannot be blamed for supporting Hamas, because anyone in that situation would feel the same way. Can one honestly say that if they were raised in Gaza that they would attain some apparently enlightened Western perspective upon the wider conflict and decide that civic discussion is the way to go, whilst perhaps that would be inarguably a better scenario for the people of Gaza? This option is not available to them. These people have been broken by years of aggression. How can we expect them to feel any other way than how they do, logistically, culturally, or morally? If one was raised in Israel, the opportunity for a secular worldview independent of ethnic, religious, or otherwise nationalist supremacy is there for them. I am far less sympathetic to the Israeli who doesn't question the nationalist or ethno-religious extremist fervour around them, because they are aware of and have access to the more supposedly enlightened values of the Western world, and have chosen to scornfully reject them. A Palestinian citizen who supports Hamas or other forms of extremist Islam, that is all that they know, and I'm not trying to assess them with a lowered standard, I'm just considering the sheer facts of the matter. If they truly knew better, as the Israelis do, in a more privileged, prosperous society, then that would be worth a consideration. But are people under constant bombardment, fear of their neighbours expanding over their homes, fear of murderous snipers, and with their water supply, electricity, and general aid filtered through that state, which considers them unequivocally less than human, how is anyone supposed to maintain a sound mental stability or belief in Gandhi-esque pacifism when this is so consistently the case for these continually suffering people? This isn't to justify Palestinian violence, but simply to put it in perspective. Norman Finkelstein has employed the useful analogy of wondering why an abused spouse, a defenseless wife in this case, might one day break, lash out, and stab a physically abusive husband. Should she be exempt from criminal justice? Perhaps not. But do we understand why she did it? Obviously. Most of us, if we could, would batter that abusive husband if we knew of his behaviour, give him the treatment which Superman gave that wife-beater in Action Comics #1, despite not being very violent people in other circumstances. If we can imagine situations where we'd want to attack someone who had committed such a great moral wrong, a violent, ruthless action, can you imagine how a Palestinian subject to harassment, impoverished home life, the presence of drones or snipers, and or having survived a missile or bomb attack might possibly feel? Maybe. Any murderous feeling that the Palestinians feel is a reflection of what the Israelis have expressed and behaved outright towards them. Initially, a sense of pan-Arab nationalism promoted a hostile alliance between Egypt, Jordan, and Syria against Israel, and later the surging of radical Islamic extremists from both Sunni and Shia sects emerging as manifestations of an inherent cultural distaste for either the Jewish people, Western settlements in their region, or both. I don't think all of the disdain toward Israel in that region was Israel's fault, but they exacerbated it. They used the disdain which other states felt toward them, some of that disdain rooted in legitimate anger at Israel's expulsion of the Palestinian populace, or malignance toward their Arab neighbours, to then justify the most aggressive hyper-nationalism which any Western-inspired nation has expressed since the European fascists. And the sad fact is, the saddest fact possibly, is the Israeli fear of being exterminated is rooted in a real and rather recent history. After the events which transpired in Europe during the 30s and 40s, why should the Jewish people trust those who profess to repeat similar violence against them, or violence against them at all? It is not about trust, it is about behaving in a way that sets a standard for how others might then treat you. If Israel were to be merciful and remorseful in how they treated the Palestinians, what could they do then? Any prospective attack would have a justified self-defense. And on pragmatic terms, the more democratic alternatives would lead to a lasting peace which the consistent aggression has overtly failed to achieve. Israel has exacerbated its poor standing with the surrounding nations due to a sense of wounded pride and murderous eye-for-an-eye brutality, which, for its own sake, has been so impractical that it's hard to fathom that supporters of Israel still see it as the most useful way forward. I actually do sympathize with the existence of a Jewish state. I think the behavior of the genocidal Europeans during the 30s and 40s appeared to somewhat justify this, if nothing else. One doesn't need to go back to Herzl. Just look at the number of displaced after the Nazi actions during their reign. Much as I support the existence of Kurdistan, a possible Khalistan, as well as, of course, Palestine itself, I think that not only does Israel have a potential right to exist, or outright right to exist, on paper certainly, without considering the destructive Nakba which occurred upon its 1948 coming into being, but that it has the right to be a religious Jewish state, much as Muslim majority states have the right to be a religious state, without separation of church and state, if it likes, as long as individuals are allowed to leave that country, if they so please. That position might bother a lot of people on the left, which I consider myself amongst, despite how self-righteous and putridly sanctimonious and self-adoring so many of you are. Although I haven't forgotten that the situation of the European Jews during the years leading up to and during the Second World War is the most important modern case study as to why left-wing politics are essential, if for no other reason than to act as a bulwark against prejudice and fascism, and how otherwise supposedly civilized countries could descend into rank barbarism. The case of the European Jews under Nazi rule is one of the most important recent case studies which affirmed where we do not want our westernized societies to go, and how it could, and what we need to prevent from ever happening again, no matter the cost. And this applies too to the Palestinian people. If we are to feel horror and shame over how the Nazi demons treated the Jewish people during their regrettable reign and existence, then so too would we for how the Palestinians are treated by the Israeli government, population, and, frankly, by much of the Western world. If you think the subject is more complicated, you are part of the problem. You have a vested interest, perhaps well-meaning, in assuming that Jewish individuals can never do anything wrong because the Nazis were so bad and they persecuted Jews, so they must be eternal victims of prejudice, presumably. I think the Western world, especially during the Cold War, had a vested interest in claiming that the Nazis were significantly evil and more racist than themselves. And the fact that the Nazis were far worse to the Jews than America, England, even France and Italy, or my own country of Australia, had been, was useful to demonstrate that, despite the transatlantic slave trade, the elimination of the indigenous Americans, the attempted breeding out of the traditional custodians of Australia, and global European empires playing master race wherever they had room to, the Nazis were much, much, much worse than the pre-existing European or Western empires, even if they were, because the allies of World War II were determined to prove their moral superiority against the new enemy of the Cold War, which had been an ally, as we all know, and that they had gone to war with Nazi Germany as a moral endeavour and not out of self-interest or self-defense. Meanwhile, there is such an inherent hostility to Muslims in the Western world due to the behaviour of ISIL most recently, but obviously rooted in 9/11 and other terror attacks subsequent to it in that decade, which has people shrugging their shoulders and wondering, well, they are violent. Whilst, yes, Muslims can find justifications for violence in their sacred texts, but why did they seek out those passages in the first place? What was causing their fiery anger toward the Western world, without justifying their eventually aggressive responses? Why would the Islamic world feel the need to resort to terrorism? Was it really out of religious devotion, binary sadism, or supposed fun? The Muslim world has been under attack by the West since certainly the 1970s or so, as both the Western proxy of Israel and the overlords of oil over in Saudi Arabia, don't underestimate their influence in this as well, frankly, both dictated that Western powers do their bidding in that region, and so other nations which were often justifiably angered at the actions of Israel or Saudi Arabia toward them saw America and the West as the true enablers of their suffering in that region of the world. And so much of the Western world, including the possibly sociopathic Sam Harris crowds, cannot fathom Muslims being victims. They hate Muslims so much for what they perceive as disrupting the comfy Western stability of the 1990s via terrorism committed in the developed world or via inspiring military activities on the West's end. But what if one could acknowledge that groups like ISIL represented the most evil conglomerate of the 20th century and were not justified in any way, shape, or form? That some forms of Islam can be antithetical to more Western or secular values of church-state separation, women's rights, rights of the LGBTQ continuum, or acceptance of religious plurality in general. And also then, that the treatment of Palestinians is an area wherein the Islamic world is right to feel grievance, is genuinely under attack, and not demanding special rights to not be offended, as the cartoon controversies displayed, an instance wherein I have to admit I was not really sympathetic to the Muslim world, for the Hebdo cartoons were in gross taste. No one deserves to be shot over a crass comic. There's something called having a nuanced view of issues, which might be tragically difficult for many people to comprehend, but I don't find it difficult, and I'm just some guy at the end of the day, so I don't see how it should be difficult to anyone else, either, to comprehend, certainly in our privileged societies either. And speaking of nuanced views, maybe we can accept that sometimes even the historically persecuted Jewish peoples would be capable, eventually, perhaps, possibly, of horrific violence and repression all their own. The fact is, and it is not a truly controversial fact either, sometimes the abused will go on to become abusers. This is sadly known, and I think that Israel uses past hurts and traumas upon the Jewish people to justify their so-called defensive violence against Palestinians and other Arab neighbours. One of the most disturbing films I have ever seen, even considering the likes of Salò, Cannibal Holocaust, Fat Girl, and August Underground. The Settlers might be Farrow's greatest and most revelatory achievement. I admire Farrow's work. Much of his journalistic efforts have been boldly inquisitive, effectively neutrally undertaken, and brokered by a sincerity in his wanting to understand and get to the truth of the issue in question. The Settlers is where his ethos has found its most potently insightful, sincerely unbiased, and politically relevant effect.